Welcome to Nightfall North. There is no need to stay awake for this. Let the day settle out of your shoulders, let the pillow take the weight of your head, and let the room go soft around you. Tonight we are going to a place that people lived in for 400 years and then did not. There is no hurry in this story. It took 4 centuries to happen, and we have all night. It begins with a man who had to leave. His name was Eric, and the sagas call him Eric the Red, for the color of his hair and perhaps for something in his temper as well. He had come to Iceland from Norway as a boy with a father who had also been asked to leave somewhere, and by the time he was grown he had a quarrel of his own and then another, and men died in them. Around the year 982, the assembly at Thorsnes made its judgment. He was outlawed, 3 years away from Iceland, away from everyone he knew. Now an outlaw could go east, back toward Norway, where the same kind of judgment was waiting for his family. Or he could go west into open water, towards something that was not quite a rumor and not quite a fact. Because there had been sightings. Years before, a man called Gunnbjorn had been blown off course and had seen skerries out there, rocks in the western sea, and behind them the gray suggestion of a coast. Nobody had gone to look properly. It was the kind of thing sailors mentioned and then did not act upon, the way we all keep a list of places we have heard of and never visit. Eric had 3 years to fill and nowhere to be, so he went to look. What he found was a coast of ice. He followed it south because there was nothing else to do and rounded the southern cape and came up the other side, and there the land changed. The ice drew back from the water. Long fjords cut inland, deep and sheltered, and at the head of them the ground was green, and the green ran up the slopes toward the mountains. There was grass, there were birds. There was driftwood on the beaches, whole trees carried across from Siberia, more wood in one bay than a man might gather in a year at home. And there was no one there, not a soul. There had been people once. He found the traces, tools, and the outlines of dwellings, left by an earlier Arctic culture that had come and gone before him, but the fjords were empty, and had been for a long time. He spent 3 winters exploring them. He gave the places names as he went, the way you do when you are alone and the silence needs furnishing. And when his sentence ran out, he sailed back to Iceland to tell everyone about it. Here the saga does something honest, and I want to give it to you exactly as it stands, because it is the earliest joke anyone made about this place, and it was made by the people who told his story. He called the country Greenland, and the saga says he chose that name, and I am quoting the sense of it plainly, because he thought people would be far more willing to go there if the land had a good name. That is what the text says. A man came back from 3 years at the edge of the map and gave it the best name he could think of, and it worked. It is worth resting on for a moment, though, that it was not entirely a lie. In the year 985, it really was green down in those fjords, greener than it would be for centuries afterward, and a man from Iceland looking at that grass would have seen exactly what he needed to see. Pasture, winter hay, a place where sheep would live. 25 ships went with him. 14 arrived, the rest turned back or went down in the crossing, and we do not know the names of the people in them, and no one ever wrote what happened out there in the water. That is the first silence in this story, and it is not the last. But 14 ships came into those fjords in the summer, and the people aboard them looked up at a green slope in a country with no one on it. And they let down the gangplanks and waded in through the cold shallows and stood in grass that came up past their knees. They came ashore into a green place, and the first thing they did was count the grass. That sounds like a small thing to begin with, but it was the whole of it. Everything that happened in Greenland for the next 400 years rested on how much hay a farm could cut in a short summer, because the hay was what carried the animals through the winter, and the animals were what carried the people. A good July meant a full byre in February. A wet one meant choosing which beasts to keep. So they spread out along the fjords, and they built. There were 2 settlements in the end, and their names are a little confusing, so let me set them down gently. The larger one they called the Eastern Settlement, and it lay in the far south, around the fjords that Eric had explored. The smaller one, the Western Settlement, lay 400 miles up the coast, near where the town of Nuuk stands today. Both of them were on the west-facing side of Greenland. The names describe how they sat in relation to each other, not where they sat on the map, and archaeologists have been patiently explaining this to people ever since. In the south, where the land was best, they raised something close to 500 farms. 16 churches in time. In the north, in the harder country, perhaps 80 farms and 1,000 people. At its fullest, all of it together may have held a few thousand souls. The estimates run from 2,000 up to 6, and anyone who gives you a firm number is being firmer than the evidence allows. The houses were turf and stone, built thick, half sunk into the slope, with the byre often joined to the dwelling so that the warmth of the animals and the warmth of the people were the same warmth. They kept sheep and goats and cattle where they could, because cattle were the mark of a proper farm even when they were in extravagance. They fished. They hunted seal along the shore and caribou inland in the autumn. And there were two things they could not make and had to buy. The first was iron. There was no usable ore and no fuel to smelt it with. Every nail, every knife, every scythe blade for cutting that essential hay had to come across the ocean or be mended and mended again and mended once more. The second was timber. Driftwood served for a great deal, but not for a ship, and a country that cannot build ships cannot fetch its own iron. So they had to have something to trade, and they did, the finest of its kind in Europe. Every summer boats went north. The journey was called the Nordisetter, and it took men up the coast for weeks, past the settlements, up toward the great bay where the walrus hauled out on the ice in their hundreds. They hunted them for the hide, which made the strongest ship's rope in the world, and for the tusks. Walrus ivory, for roughly 200 years, if you were a bishop in France or a carver in Cologne or a king commissioning a set of chessmen, the ivory in your hands had very likely come out of a Greenland boat. It was the one thing this small, cold, far-off community had that all of Europe wanted, and they organized their year around getting it. And with the wealth of it, they built what people build. In the year 1124, they asked for a bishop of their own and received one. At Gardar, on a green tongue of land between two fjords, they raised a cathedral of stone, 27 meters long, with a great byre beside it that could hold 100 cattle, because a bishop in Greenland was also a farmer. They sent their tithe to Rome, and because they had no coin, they sent it in walrus tusks, and there is a Vatican record from centuries later of the church trying to work out what all that ivory was actually worth. They were not clinging on at the end of the world. They were a diocese. They had a cathedral and a calendar and their own laws, and they were the northernmost Christians on earth. And in the summer, over water that was clear of ice, from a stone tower on a green shore, a bell rang, the most ordinary sound in Europe, ringing at the very edge of it. For a long while, that bell rang over a world that was warmer than it would ever be again. The centuries when Greenland was settled sat inside a mild stretch of climate, not dramatically warm, not tropical, nothing you would have noticed from inside a single lifetime, but enough. Enough that the fjord stayed open later in the year, enough that hay grew where it would later fail. The people who sailed west in 985 arrived, without knowing it, in the best 400 years that place had to offer. And then slowly the world cooled. It began somewhere around the 1300s, and it went on for a very long time, and historians call it the Little Ice Age. In Europe it meant hard winters and thin harvests and rivers freezing that had not frozen before. In the North Atlantic it meant sea ice, drifting further south each decade, gathering along the Greenland coast and lying there later into the summer. Consider what that does to a place that must be reached by ship. The sailing route from Norway had always been difficult. Now it became a gamble, and then it became rare, and each decade fewer masts came over the horizon, and every one of those ships had been carrying iron and timber and news and priests and the ordinary reassurance of being somewhere that other people also went. But the cold was only part of it, and here is the strangest thing that modern research has found, something no one in Greenland could possibly have understood, because it happened too slowly to see. The sea was rising against them. As the climate cooled, the great ice sheet in the interior began to grow again, and a mass of ice that size does two things to the water around it. It pulls the ocean toward itself, gravitationally, gathering the sea up around its own edges, and its sheer weight presses the land down, sinking the very ground the ice sits near. So while the world's oceans were doing one thing, the water along the Greenland shore was doing another. Models published in recent years suggest that over the 4 centuries the Norse lived there, the sea in those southern fjords rose by as much as 3 meters, and that something on the order of 200 square kilometers of coastal land went under. And it was the lowest land that went first, the flat ground at the heads of the fjords, the soft green meadows nearest the water, which are exactly the fields you cut hay from. Nobody watched this happen. That is what makes it so quiet. Across a human lifetime, it was a few centimeters, a boathouse that needed rebuilding a little further up, a corner of a field that turned to marsh and was left to the birds, a landing stage that had to be moved once in a grandfather's memory. No one wrote it down because there was nothing to write. It only becomes a catastrophe when you stand far enough back to see all 400 years at once, and no one living there could do that. Meanwhile, inside the houses, people were adapting, and we know this in an unusually direct way. When archaeologists examine the bones of the Greenland Norse, they can read what those people ate. The chemistry of the ocean is different from the chemistry of the land, and it leaves its signature in the skeleton. And what the bones show is a steady, remarkable shift. The earliest settlers ate like Icelandic farmers, mostly from their own animals. The latest ate mostly from the sea seal, above all, in some cases for the great majority of their food. That is not a people refusing to change. That is a people changing profoundly, over generations, learning a coast, giving up the diet their grandparents thought was proper, and staying. They stayed a long time. They kept the sheep and cut the hay and rang the bell and buried their dead facing east, and they went out after seal, and they held on through winters that their great-grandparents would not have recognized. And on some of those farms today, if you walk down through the grass to where the old home field ended, you find that it does not end. It goes on under the water, and the tide comes in over it twice a day, and it has been doing that so patiently that no one ever noticed the moment it began. The water came up slowly enough that no one thought to write it down. And the same is true of almost everything that happened next. We have no chronicle of these years. What we have instead is one man, sent out on an errand, who came back and told people what he had seen, and even his account reaches us at second hand. His name was Ivar Bardarson. He was a Norwegian churchman, and in 1341 he was sent across to Greenland to look after the bishop's seat at Gardar. The bishopric had a problem that would become familiar. Bishops were being appointed to Greenland who never actually went there. Someone had to mind the cathedral. Ivar went, and he stayed for something close to 20 years. And at some point during those years, the date is not certain, but it is usually put around the middle of the century, he was sent north on an official errand. He was to sail up the coast to the western settlement, the smaller of the two, the one out near where Nuuk is now. There had been reports, something about the northern settlement had gone quiet. We do not know what he expected, a dispute perhaps, trouble with the neighboring people, or a district that had stopped sending its tithe, or simply a rumor that needed correcting. Whatever it was, a party of men was gathered and boats were made ready, and they went north up that long gray coast for the better part of a month. And they arrived, and there was no one there. The account that comes down to us is very plain. When they came there, they found no man, neither Christian nor heathen. The houses were standing, the farms were standing, and the animals were still in the valleys, cattle and sheep running loose, gone wild, grazing across the home fields with nobody left to bring them in. Nobody, not a body, not a grave dug in haste, not a sign of a fight. The report mentions no burning. It mentions no bones, just standing houses, and a settlement of perhaps 1,000 people that had become an empty valley with livestock in it. And then comes the detail that has stayed with everyone who has ever read this passage, and it is such a human, practical, unbearable thing. They rounded up as many of the wild animals as their boats would carry. They slaughtered them, and they sailed home. There is no lament in the account. There is no wondering aloud about what had become of anyone. There is a party of men on official business who found a district vacant, took what was there because it would otherwise be wasted, and went back south to report it. Now honesty, Ivar Bardarson's original report has not survived, not a line of it in his own hand. What we have is a later compilation, copied and recopied and translated across the centuries, with other material folded in along the way, and scholars have argued for a long time about which parts are really his and which parts drifted in afterwards. It is our single best glimpse of what happened to the western settlement, and it is a glimpse through several panes of old glass. But the archaeology, as far as it goes, does not contradict him. The northern farms were abandoned in that broad period, and what excavation finds there is not a massacre. It is an ending, the last rooms of the last houses, occupied a little longer than the rest, with the small evidence of people eating what was left. On one farm, the bones of a hunting dog, butchered, which tells you something about a final winter, without needing anything else said about it. Whether they starved, or gave up and walked south to join their relatives in the other settlement, or boarded a ship for Iceland when one finally came, we do not know and may never. All three have been argued for seriously by people who have spent their lives on this. What we can say is that 1,000 people stopped being in a place, and the only record anyone made of it was a note about how many animals could be fitted into the boats. The valleys went on being green. The loose cattle went on grazing them, season after season. moving down to the water in the summer and up under the walls in the bad weather, keeping the old routine of a farm with nobody left to keep it for. In the other settlement, the one further south, life went on for another 60 years. We know very little about those 60 years, and I want to be careful here because it is tempting to fill them with decline. To picture the churches emptying, the farms falling in one by one, a long sad guttering out, that may be what happened. But it is a picture we would be painting ourselves out of hindsight, and the one clear window we have into that time shows us something quite different. It shows a wedding. On the 16th of September in the year 1408, two people were married in the church at Hvalsey, on a fjord in the eastern settlement. His name was Thorstein Olafsson, hers was Sigrid Bjornstadtir. They were both Icelanders. He had come out with a ship, and she was staying with relatives, and they had met in Greenland and decided to marry there. And the church was full. That is in the record. The banns were read on 3 Sundays beforehand properly, as the law required. A priest named Paul Halvardsson performed the ceremony. There were witnesses, named ones, respectable ones, who put their word to it afterwards. There was, by every indication, a wedding of the ordinary and joyful kind, in a stone church with a congregation in it, and a priest at the altar and 2 young people at the front of it. The church at Hvalsey is still there. It is the best preserved Norse building in Greenland. The walls stand nearly to their full height, the gables intact, the doorway square and sound, 600 years after anyone last swept the floor of it. You can walk in. The roof is gone, so it is open to the sky, and there is grass growing where the congregation stood, and the fjord is gray and quiet just below the wall. Now the detail that gives this its weight. We do not know about this wedding because anyone in Greenland recorded it. We know about it because Thorstein and Sigrid sailed home. Their ship left in 1410. They arrived in Iceland and settled at her family's farm in the north in 1413 and lived out their lives there, and at some point a question arose about whether the marriage had been lawful, as questions did about inheritance and property. So letters were written. Icelandic churchmen set down what had happened at Hvalsey and named the priest and the witnesses, and the matter went up through the proper channels toward Rome. Which means the last surviving document about the Norse in Greenland was written somewhere else, by people who had left, about a day that had gone perfectly well. There is one other thing in that same body of correspondence, and it belongs here for honesty's sake, because it is the only other event from those years that anyone bothered to preserve. A man named Colgrim was burned at Hvalsey a few years earlier, convicted of having seduced a woman by witchcraft, and she is said to have lost her mind afterwards and died, so it was not a paradise. It was a small, isolated, deeply Christian community of the 15th century, with all that this implies, and it did to one of its own what such communities did. But the wedding is the last page. After 1410 there is nothing. No letter, no chronicle entry, no ship's report, no note in a Norwegian ledger. Not a single line anywhere in Europe that tells us what became of the people who were standing in that church. And it is worth sitting with how strange that is. This was not a lost tribe in an unmapped place. These were people who paid tithes to Rome, whose bishop was appointed in Norway, who belonged to a kingdom and a church in a trading world. And that world simply stopped hearing from them, and this is the part that lands hardest did not appear to notice for a very long time. There was no expedition sent to find out, no inquiry. Norway had the Black Death to survive, and then a union with Denmark, and the ivory trade had moved on to other suppliers, and the sailing route was full of ice. Greenland slipped out of the correspondence the way a distant acquaintance slips out of a life without anyone deciding it. The church at Hvalsey kept standing. It is standing now. The gables held, the doorway held, the walls held, and the grass came up inside, and nobody ever wrote down who closed the door for the last time, or whether anyone thought to close it at all. 300 years later, a Norwegian priest sailed west to find them. His name was Hans Eged, and he had spent years in a parish in the Lofoten Islands, becoming quietly obsessed with a question nobody else was asking: what had happened to the Greenlanders, not as history, as a pastoral matter. He believed they were still out there, a Christian people, cut off before the Reformation, still keeping the old faith with nobody to instruct them. He wrote letters. He petitioned merchants and bishops and eventually the king. And in 1721, after years of being told no, he sailed with his wife and their children into the Davis Strait to bring the Lutheran Reformation to a congregation that had been waiting 3 centuries for news. He found the ruins. He walked among the fallen walls of the farms. He found the churches roofless, the stones still square and good. In time he found Hvalsey and Gardar and the great cathedral byre. And he found people, of course, but they were Inuit, living well in a country the Norse had never fully learned, and they were not the descendants he had come for, and they had no memory of Christians to give him. Hans Egede spent 15 years in Greenland. He buried his wife there. He never found a single Norseman, and he seems never quite to have given up expecting to. So what happened? It is a fair question to end on, and the honest answer is that we have moved, over the last few decades, from having one confident explanation to having several careful ones, and this is what progress usually looks like. The old story was climate. The cold came, the farms failed, the people were too stubborn to change, and so they died in their houses. It is a tidy story, and it is very hard to sustain now, because those bones tell us they changed enormously. They went from farmers to sealers over a few generations, which is not stubbornness. The ivory matters more than anyone used to think. Studies tracing walrus tusks from Europe back to their source have shown Greenland supplying the continent for 2 centuries, and then the market turning, elephant ivory returning to Europe in quantity, prices falling, the tusks in later shipments coming from smaller animals and from further and further north, the signature of a hunt chasing a receding resource. If your one export loses its value, everything that depended on it becomes fragile. Add the sea coming up over the hayfields, add sailing routes closing with ice, add the Black Death gutting Norway and Iceland, and with them the far end of a supply line that had always been thin. And the neighbors, the Inuit, arrived from the north during these centuries, and the two peoples certainly met. There are Norse objects on Inuit sites and Inuit objects on Norse ones, so there was contact and probably trade. There are Inuit oral traditions, written down long afterwards, that tell of fighting. The truth is that the evidence is thin and has often been used to tell whatever story the teller wanted, and the careful position today is that we do not know what that relationship mostly was. But here is what strikes me most, and it is a thing that is not there. There is no catastrophe in the ground, no mass grave, no burned farmsteads, no bodies left where they fell. What excavation finds instead at site after site is emptiness and absence of the portable, valuable things. The church bells are gone, the good ironwork is gone, crucifixes, tools, the things you would carry if you were leaving and could not come back. Which points gently but persistently at the least dramatic answer of all, that they left, not all at once and not in one clean decision, but the way a village empties in any century, a family at a time on whatever ship came, back to Iceland or Norway where there were cousins, until the ones remaining were too few to hold a service or crew a boat or cut enough hay, and then they went too. Nobody wrote it down because nobody experienced it as an ending. Each of them only experienced living. And the fjords went back to being what they had been before Eric came up them looking for grass. The turf walls softened and slumped and became long, low ridges under the moss, which is what they are today, and the grass grew over them and kept growing every summer for 600 summers, unwatched. It is still growing. There are sheep in those valleys again, put there in the last century by farmers who came for the same reason the first ones did. And in the long light of a southern Greenland evening you can stand at Eric's old fjord and see green running up the slope toward the mountains, exactly as he saw it, exactly as it was described to 25 ships worth of people who believed it. A good name for a country, and not a lie after all.